Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this event organised by the Centre for Research in Communication and Culture. My name is Belfiore and I'm one of the co-director of the Centre with Cristian Vaccari, who will welcome you in a minute. Just a brief word of welcome. It's a pleasure to be able to fulfill one of the purposes of the CRCC, which is to bring together researchers from across Loughborough University who work on a number of themes in research on communication and culture, together with guests and colleagues from outside to have interesting conversations and to share our research. And whilst it's a shame that we can't do it in person yet, I'm also thrilled that we've been able to maximise the opportunities offered by the new online forms of communication and sharing that we have become accustomed to in the past year, so that we can still have these conversations, these sharing events, despite the unusual circumstances in which we find ourselves working. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass the mic virtually to my co-director, Cristian Vaccari, so he can welcome you to today's event, and then we will start as we have a wonderfully packed program for today. So over to Cristian.
Thank you, Elle, and welcome everyone from myself as well. I'm really grateful for your presence here, both to the presenters and to the attendees. Both from Loughborough University and from outside Loughborough. Just a brief point of order about our agenda. We have 3 panels focused on understanding the pandemic, protecting us from the pandemic, and adapting to the pandemic. We have come up with these panels by way of soliciting contributions from all the colleagues in and beyond the School of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Loughborough, who have been conducting exciting research, most of which with relevant policy implications on the key problem of our time. So the way the panels are going to work is that there will be a chair, and we're very grateful to Professor Lisanne Gibson, our new school dean, for chairing the first panel. And the presenters will present in the order in which they are included in the program for about 15 minutes. Then there will be a Q&A session. Now, here on this function of Teams, everyone can add questions into the Q&A text chat. And so we encourage you to do that as you see interesting points raised by the presenters that you would like to hear more about, or you have some constructive criticism, or you want to make a comment. Please do that, put those comments in writing, and then we will select those comments. The chairs will select those comments and put those questions and comments to the presenters at the end of the presentation session. I should also remind you that the conversation in the chat can take place even outside of the panels. So maybe not all the questions will be answered during the live Q&A, but most of them will, and those that won't be answered, the conversation can continue via the Q&A function on Microsoft Teams. That's all from me. Really grateful again to everyone for being here, and I now very happily hand the mic to Professor Lisanne Gibson to chair the first panel.
Hi. Lovely to meet you all. So it falls to me to introduce the first panel, but I want to be a bit cheeky, and before I do, I just want to say some words about the centre. So Centre for Research in Communication and Culture. So this is one of 3 research centres across the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at Loughborough. This is a world-leading research centre which covers a range of research themes in the space of communication and culture, so ranging from cultural economy and policy, through language and social interaction, media, memory and history, migrations and nation, political communication and social, political and cultural theory. And the research that's happening in the centre at the moment is incredibly innovative, incredibly exciting. And I just want to congratulate Ellie and Cristian for being able to keep up the dynamism of research and also research dissemination through the centre over this last challenging 14 months. And I know we're all looking forward to being able to engage with each other physically and you know, face to face in due course. So session number 1 today in this event on COVID communication and culture is focusing on understanding. So we've got 2 speakers, Professor Sabina Mihelj, I apologise, Sabina, if I have mispronounced that, and also Professor James Stanyer. Both are academics here at Loughborough. So I'm going to introduce them individually. So Sabina, I'll introduce you, and then separately, James, when you're about to speak, I'll introduce you with your bio, if that's okay. So Sabina is Professor of Media and Cultural Analysis here at Loughborough, and her research focuses on the comparative study of media cultures across both traditional and new media, with a focus on nationalism, identity, Eastern and Central Europe and the Cold War. And the paper that she's delivering for us today is on news consumption, political polarization and trust during the COVID-19 pandemic. Over to you, Sabina.
Thank you very much, Lisanne, for the introduction, and thank you to organisers for organising this event. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about our research here today. I'm saying our because although I'm presenting today on my own, the research that I'll be talking about is a result of a team effort. We've been conducting this research together with Katherine Kondor, who is a research associate in our school, and Vaclav Štětkà. So this was very much a team effort that actually resulted from a project that had, as you might imagine, nothing to do with the pandemic initially. This is a project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council that we started working on in 2019, and that looks at the role of news consumption in the rise of illiberalism, political polarization, and the decline of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm part of a larger team together with Vaclav, Kathy. We also have Dr. Fanny Toth working with us, and 3 local research assistants who were helping us collect and process parts of data over the course of the project. We're looking at 4 countries specifically: Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Serbia. And we were using a multi-method research strategy ranging from population surveys, expert surveys, digital tracking of media consumption, as well as media diaries and semi-structured interviews with audiences. The project also has an important knowledge exchange component, so trying to generate impact, in particular in area of media policy, as well as journalistic practice. So we're collaborating with European Federation of Journalists, European Broadcasting Union, and others. So, as I said, it wasn't our intention to focus on the pandemic, but as we were embarking on the last phase of data collection in February 2020, it became obvious that our project will be in part about the pandemic as well. So we conducted the first wave of 120 qualitative interviews with participants from all 4 countries in February. Then this was followed by a media diary phase over the course of March, which coincided exactly with the introduction of lockdowns in all 4 countries. And finally, we conducted the second follow-up interviews in April remotely. We were very lucky to keep most of our participants on board throughout the process, a very low attrition rate for a project using media diaries, which was very good to see. Our participants were recruited from a representative population survey that we conducted prior to that, and included roughly equal numbers of men and women, 3 generations, as well as participants from different political and ideological persuasions. So a few words about the context, the research context that we were faced with as we were starting looking at our data. So the early research on media and COVID-19 was gathering pace very, very fast, it's fair to say, but it was largely driven at that stage by concerns over the infodemic of misinformation that was spreading online. It was also because of that partly focused primarily on digital media and disinformation. It was largely based on quantitative data, so surveys, and very often limited still to single country studies, as well as countries located in the global north and the west in particular. So we realized that with our particular data set, we had a bit of an advantage, or rather an opportunity to look at kinds of questions and kinds of aspects that other projects conducted at the time weren't able to. So we adopted a holistic approach to media use, not just digital media. We were obviously using qualitative data, and we had a cross-country comparison at our hands from the very start, with a focus on Eastern Europe that isn't often in the limelight when such problems arise. We explored a wide range of questions in relation to that, but I'll tell you first a few words about the 4 countries that we're looking at, just to make you aware that these countries are quite different, enabling a meaningful comparison. So on one hand, we have Poland and Hungary, who had an early democratic consolidation, then experienced significant democratic backsliding and political polarization in recent years. Czech Republic, on the other hand, where democracy is still reasonably stable, and backsliding was not as extensive. And finally, Serbia, that never really fully transitioned to a functioning democracy, and where state of media freedom also was worsened in recent years, and it experienced high polarization. So we were able actually to compare countries with very different political and media systems, as well as considerably different responses to the pandemic, in the sense that the levels of politicization of the pandemic were much higher in Hungary and Serbia than they were in Czech Republic, with Poland somewhere in the middle. So we looked at a wide variety of questions over the course of our research, but I'll focus on the 5 that I'm listing here on the slide. So first of all, looking at how people's news consumption actually changed during the pandemic and during the early weeks of lockdown. And also, how can we explain these changes? Secondly, which channels of crisis communication proved most effective in reaching the public? Thirdly, how was the effectiveness of crisis communication shaped by the political and media context in these 4 countries? Fourthly, did citizens trust experts and health authorities? And what was the role of media in this context, so in shaping trust in experts? And finally, if I get a chance to talk about that, I'll tell you a little bit about what we found about the role of digital and social media in pandemic communication more generally. So looking first at the key changes, these resemble the kinds of changes we saw pretty much everywhere where research was conducted so far. So first of all, there was a sharp increase in total news consumption, an increase in television viewing, so leading many commentators to talk about a return of television. Also increased the reliance on public service television in all 4 countries, increase in social media use and digital news consumption as well as decline in press consumption. Now, early explanations of these tendencies have primarily focused on the growth in the need of the public to get access to timely information about the pandemic, which is perhaps understandable. But what we were able to uncover in our research was that other factors played an important role in shaping these changes in news consumption. First of all, the impact of lockdown and the particular measures of lockdown that were introduced in each of the countries, which by and large forced people to spend more time indoors and at home, which is why we felt, and we showed through our data, that there was a growth in reliance on domestic media and in particular on television as well. The impact of lockdown also led, obviously, to people having more time, especially those who were on furlough, but not necessarily, which again was an important factor mentioned by many of our participants in explaining their increase in use of news. Disruption of press distribution was another factor, and finally the introduction of live briefings, which led many of our participants to choose television in particular as their preferred mode of engagement with pandemic news, and also turned the pandemic into a massive media event, or even a media disaster, you might argue. Looking at which crisis communication channels our participants engaged with, first of all, virtually everyone reported following live briefings and press conferences organized by either the health authorities or governments, usually both of them together. Most often these were followed through television, and especially through public service television. Secondly, news reports about briefings and press conferences were also important. Many of our participants also turned to government and health authorities' websites dedicated to COVID. And a smaller number, but still a significant proportion, mentioned encountering public service adverts on social media. What became apparent, however, was that not all of these channels were effective, or rather that exposure in this case did not necessarily equal trust. So in particular, in two of our countries, Hungary and Serbia, several participants actually reported distrusting the information that was provided through government channels and through public service media as well. In Poland, this was to some extent evident, but here participants trusted the information about the virus and about the pandemic measures that were introduced in Poland, but distrusted any other more general political news that was provided through public service television. So a bit of a mixed response here. But it's important really to keep this distinction between trustworthiness and exposure when it comes to crisis information. Another issue, as I said, we looked at was trust in expert and the factors that shaped this trust, including the role of news media and media more generally that were being used to access expert information. Now, the first thing to say here is that in all 4 countries, participants expressed a general trust in experts as something that they took for granted. However, and then in addition to that, also several participants mentioned trusting experts they know personally, which was news to us because this was a factor that actually isn't mentioned in existing research on factors that shape trust in experts. And finally, in 2 of the countries, again, the same ones, Serbia and Hungary, several participants distrusted experts that were involved in leading the public health response in their countries. Now, why was that? First of all, and most prominently, reasons had to do with political context, with the perception of these experts, the officially appointed experts, lacking independence from politicians, and therefore being unable to follow their expert judgment in developing and providing guidance on the pandemic response. What was also interesting was that some of our participants, again, a small but significant number, commented on the what they perceived as wrong communication choices of experts. So experts appearing in what they felt were untrustworthy media channels. And the third factor that became apparent among some participants, this one not just in Serbia and Hungary, was the presence of controversy. So as soon as our participants felt there was a controversy among experts themselves over particular measures, then that would be another reason for why they wouldn't trust the guidance. So a typical contrast here was the contrast between proponents of lockdown and a small minority of experts who were appearing in media arguing against lockdown and for so-called herd immunity. There was also some debate in relation to that over mask wearing. Another thing we looked at in relation to that was what happened then once people distrusted expert guidance that was provided through mainstream media and through officially appointed experts. And here what became apparent was that in such situations, our participants did turn to social media, either to look for reasonably trustworthy sources, often looking at advice from foreign experts or provided in foreign media. However, among a small but significant minority, these were also people who then became exposed to untrustworthy experts, so to speak, such as, for instance, Dr. Güdeni in Hungary, who is actually a fitness personality who has some experience working as a pharmacist and has a pharmaceutical degree, a background in that, but was very prominently a figure that advocated against lockdown measures as well as against mask wearing in Hungary. So this was an example of the link between distrust in experts and vulnerability to disinformation in this case that was spreading through social media. This brings me then to the final and more general question about the role of digital media. In the pandemic, what we observed across all 4 countries that, of course, channels of social media in particular were channels of misinformation and conspiracy theories, again, most common in Serbia and Hungary in particular. However, it's important to consider that these channels were also important as alternative sources of trustworthy information in a context where official information provided through mainstream channels was not necessarily regarded trustworthy or reliable. And this is an example here that I'm showing of one of our Serbian participants who was watching the live address by the Serbian Prime Minister, who was announcing the state of emergency, and then immediately looking for information online on whether or not such a measure is actually legitimate and legal. And there were several cases like that, or in relation to looking for expert information, where participants looked for alternative sources of information online, often using also social media. A final point to note in relation to social media and public debate was an interesting phenomenon we observed across the 4 countries, and that was a high measure of privatization and depolitization of debate that was going on online, and in particular in the social media environment. And what we mean by that was that when people turned to social media during the pandemic, especially during the early weeks, it wasn't so much to discuss the pandemic or the pandemic response, but it was to keep in touch with members and family, as you can see from some of my images, to share lighthearted humor related to the pandemic, and in general also quite consciously avoiding political debates about the pandemic and the pandemic response. Now, obviously, that may have been a situation specific to the early period of the pandemic, but it was interesting that it was characteristic across the board, across the 4 countries. When public debate did happen, it normally then occurred in family circles or in private social communication channels online. A few conclusions and implications we can draw from this. So first of all, shifts in news consumption were, as I said, to an important extent driven by the specific policy responses to the pandemic. Secondly, I hope I showed you persuasively the importance of independent, trustworthy media for effective crisis communication. What also became apparent was high potential for distrust and divisiveness in more polarized political environments where media freedom is lower and where the pandemic was politicized. Also clear was the importance of expert independence and careful communication strategies for public trust in experts. And finally, an emphasis on digital and social media as not only channels of misinformation, but also as sources of trustworthy information, which I believe has implications also for media regulation in crisis moments like this. And to conclude, let me just draw your attention to a few publications that we have coming through imminently. And if you'd like to hear more about our project, we also have a project website here that I'm including a link to.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sabina. Timed perfectly, and also more importantly a fascinating piece. So just to remind everybody, if you capture comments and questions in the Q&A box, then we will come and deal with all the comments and questions together at the end after James's paper. So I'd like to introduce James Stanyer, who is a professor in communication and media analysis here at Loughborough, and his research interests lie primarily in areas of national and transnational political communication And he's going to talk to us today, as you can see, about the enduring appeal of public service broadcasters, news and information consumption in the UK during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, James, over to you.
Just about kind of by way of background to the paper, this is a paper born of personal experience from the first lockdown in March to June last year, which seems a long time ago now, but my own search for information and about news, the latest happenings, and feeling this desire to find out what's happening and to be part of feeling updated about the latest events. And at the same time, wondering how people in the UK more generally were getting their news and information about the pandemic. So in a sense, it's against this backdrop, particularly of fake news. I was also sort of, and how that kind of dominated public discourse, also a sense of more broader kind of interest in how people were getting sources and how discerning they were about the information they accessed and how trustworthy it was, and how reliant they were on public service news and information, given the long-term decline in public service broadcasting's audience share that has been with us for a while now. So I was kind of looking around for available data. There wasn't, I hadn't got the money for a survey at the time, so I was looking around for available data that could cast some light about audience media use during the pandemic. And I found that Ofcom, one of the UK's media regulator, was conducting a survey. There were two surveys actually being conducted. One was a private survey funded by the Reuters Institute in Oxford, and the other was a publicly funded survey by the UK media regulator Ofcom. And this was conducted by Populous for Ofcom. Over the period of the first lockdown, a sample of 2,000 adults, 16 plus, drawn from a large panel of 185,000. And one of the novelties of this survey was that it was a longitudinal survey conducted every weekend for the 14-week period of the pandemic, for the lockdown period. So in a way, they gives us, and I thought this is an excellent set of data freely available online that could shed some insight into public use of the media and attitudes towards different news channels and sources of information. So a kind of first port of call was to start to read about what existing research could tell us about where people get news and information in extreme events. And that research, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but because of time, but that research shows that news and information consumption, as Sabina mentioned, surges in the aftermath of what I term extreme events, before declining often quite rapidly to pre-event levels. And this tail off quick is often very quick, as noted from the initial event. But the consumption is also focused on a few key trusted sources. And these variously tend to be, according to existing research, the dominant news providers of the time. These could be television channels, mainly because often the research conducted about news and media information consumption post extreme events was often being conducted, at least in a period where television has been a dominant medium. So based on a review of the findings of existing research prior to the pandemic, one might expect audiences to flock to the main public service news channels they trust to gain news and information before returning to their normal consumption habits. However, a couple of things I think are important to mention. First, much of the research, as noted, was on crises that occurred in a kind of pre-internet age, or at least when the internet was in its infancy. Also, the extreme events examined were short in length when compared to the pandemic, and certainly nowhere near the 13 weeks or so the first lockdown period. Secondly, there were the main broadcasters and news channels, which we know, as I mentioned earlier, have lost audience share dramatically. And also a lot of the research had very little to say about demographic variations in consumption. So I think these are really important points that we need to think about. And Sabina mentioned earlier about the rise of new technologies, the internet, social media as a main way through which people get news and information. So taking those on board, I think, for emerging expectations, at least from this initial foray into the literature. First, that news and information consumption would be dominated by internet and legacy media in the shape of traditional TV outlets are still important, but don't really play a significant role as they perhaps did in the past. Second, given the long period of the pandemic, we might experience the period of uncertainty reduction to be longer too, and consumption does not tail off quickly. But there's little information, and there is a very little, I should say, information avoidance. Third expectation, given the nature of the pandemic, the public are more likely to use more serious news outlets. They feel like more trusted news brands, but not necessarily through the through the internet, but they're still very wedded to using trusted news brands. And the fourth expectation surrounds the use of and trust, and this varies by age and ethnicity, perhaps. We might expect certain variations by age and ethnicity, but research and other forms suggest this will not necessarily be significant differences. So with those, bearing those expectations in mind about what the literature informs potential findings, I want to start with the first expectation, and this is in some senses shows this is the kind of over the 13-week period. This is a showing the people, respondents saying they use a particular news or information source about the corona outbreak. I've color coded this, and we can see the BBC television stands out massively over the period as the main source of news and information about the coronavirus outbreak over the period of time. There is a slight decline over the period of time from the first period when lockdown started to week 13 when lockdown began to be lifted. And then we go, but there's a real standout difference between the BBC over this time period, not the dramatic decline, but also if we go down looking at the color codings here, we can see that the top news sources used all the main, if you like, the main broadcasters, the main news broadcasters, BBC and ITV, but also BBC Online. And then you get begin to get social media, Facebook, and also then going down BBC Radio and so on and so forth. So in terms of the tail off, again, simple scatter with fit line here. To what extent, the question asked respondents, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? I'm trying to avoid news about coronavirus strongly, and this shows the strongly agree and slightly agree. And we can see that the numbers are trying to avoid or saying that they are trying to avoid news and coronavirus increases slightly over the 13-week period, but not dramatically so. So based on the first two expectations, the BBC and public service broadcasting seems very much the key source of news, and the tail off that we might have expected based on the literature didn't really materialize in over that first lockdown period. So if you then move on to the third expectation to do with trust and use, I took this is a group scatter plot looking at those who basically comparing use and trust of news media sources over the 13-week period. This is a sort of a 13-week average. This compares, it's saying one sense on the y-axis, it's about those saying they used, and on the x-axis, those saying they trusted. And what is clear is there was no, and this is borne out in other literature, there is not really a strong correlation between use and trust. And actually, what it shows is perhaps a more complex pattern of news and information source use over the 13-week period. And we see it, the main standout, if you can see my cursor here, the main standout is again very much in line with the previous figures, the BBC TV. But we can also see that the BBC was seen as probably widely used and trusted, but there were also sources, as we see here, that were trusted but not widely used that much, sources that were, if you like, not particularly trusted but and not particularly used, and those that were perhaps, if you like, used more and not particularly trusted. So this got me thinking about, more generally about, in terms of media trust, about the relationship between trust and use, and whether there's a kind of discussion going on in the literature about whether there is a kind of trust drives use, or what that relationship is, and attempts to correlate that relationship. But in a way, I found I ran a group scatter a plot and a two-step cluster numbers. And I found between trust and use, and I kind of documented 4 clusters, really. What I would call low use, low trust, lower use, higher trust, high use, lower trust, and high use, higher trust. And I think you can see from the legend here how it corresponds. But I kind of, just to give you a general overview of the type of news and information sources. So the triangle is pretty much a standout high trust, high use, which would be a source that is widely trusted and widely used, namely the BBC television. But these sources in the square are lower use but higher trust. These were government information sources, NHS Direct, which released information, local, and were seen as trustworthy, but not necessarily widely used as much as, say, the BBC. And here we have a cluster of lower trust, lower use sources, which were used but not particularly trusted, not really used very much, such as the tabloid media. And here we have what I would call high use but lower trust. These were social media news sources that were used widely by certain people during the pandemic, but not particularly trusted. And in the sense, the public saw and realized that the news sources weren't particularly trusted, although they did use them quite widely. So what does this mean in terms of, I kind of then looked in terms of age and the final point about demographic differences. And in the sense, what are we, and these are just a kind of rough comparison for you. What it shows is there was some statistically significant differences between the over 55s and the under 34s. And this is the percentage of those saying they consulted, gained sources, information about particular coronavirus outbreak from these particular sources of news information. And here we can see, again, if we just take traditional media first, then we can see a real difference. This percentage saying they used the BBC TV, under 34s was just shy of 50%, and the over 55s over 80%. So the over 55s were significantly more likely to get their news, statistically significantly more likely to get their news from legacy news sources than the under 35s. And the under 35s were, in a sense, statistically more significantly likely to get their news from social media. So we can see a kind of difference in a way, although the overall picture shows perhaps a trend towards gaining news and information from, the continued importance of public service media. Facebook and other news sources were a particularly important source of news and information for those under the age of 34. Of course, this needs further research to break into more detail about this. Again, I just briefly going through this relationship, exploring this relationship between, again, the use and trust. We can see a distinct, and this is just replicates the chart that I showed earlier, looking at use and trust. Again, the plot shows the difference with which the BBC is seen as an important source between the over 55s and those under 34. And in a way, the way in which social media is much more important to those under the age of 34. So I also looked at any differences between by ethnic background. Although there are some differences, none of the differences were statistically significant between ethnic minority groupings. So towards some concluding points then. So despite the omnipresence of the internet and social media, television news remained the dominant source of information about the pandemic, and the public turned to established media sources in the shape of traditional legacy brands. At least that's what I found from the survey. There was gradual decline in consumption from a peak at the start of the pandemic, but those saying they avoided it only rose slightly. So there wasn't that dramatic drop off that had been kind of flagged up in the literature. This suggests that efforts to gain news and information are, I would argue, directly linked to the duration of the period of uncertainty. In prolonged extreme events, uncertainty and anxiety remain higher for longer and therefore compel audiences to continue to search for news and information. The survey shows that consumption was dominated by legacy media outlets, although other sources were consulted. The BBC remained the dominant source of news and information for the entire period, although perhaps more dominant for certain age groups. So, in line with the literature, again, as I noted earlier, the evidence is weak for any overall relationship between media and trust. And over the 13 weeks, the public used a wide range of sources, some of which they trusted, and some much less so. The public, I would argue, were discerning. They weren't necessarily gullible, and in a sense realized that some of the sources they were using were perhaps less trustworthy than others. There were some significant differences between the age groups and where they got their news and information, and the over 55s, particularly when compared to those under 34. And those over 55 were significantly more likely to be more trusting of a single source and get their news from BBC TV. And again, this chimes very much with recent research by Ofcom, which suggests during 2020, in relation to the use of BBC, found older people aged over 55 consumed much more BBC content than the UK average, while younger generations consumed much less. And although there were some differences between ethnic groupings in relation to the use of legacy media, these were not statistically significant. So all in all, I feel more informed about what happened during the pandemic, and this is kind of part of a paper that is in progress to be published.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, James. Really interesting paper. Thank you. So here we are with the Q&A session. So we're going to take questions and comments for both James's and Sabina's papers now together. I think we've got 15 minutes left in the session, so we've got some generous time for questions. In order to ask a question, if you just post it or make a comment, if you just post it in the live event Q&A, and then I will read it out and the speaker will address it. If you can be sure in your question, if you can capture who the question is for, whether it's for James or Sabina. Okay, brilliant. So to start with our first question, which James is for you. So from Liz. So what does the future hold, given the age differences, James, you're showing for old media? What are your speculations here?
Thank you, Liz. It's a difficult one. I think. What does the future hold? I think in a way to answer the question in two ways. One is perhaps whether we're witnessing a kind of a generational shift. I think perhaps in a way young people now have access to different news sources. Perhaps they're not going to go back to television like an older generation. So maybe we're just seeing this as a kind of the last dominance of television as a medium. But I do think that news brands are going to be increasingly important, particularly in an age where trust in media is declining. And I think people are going to still want a move towards trusted news brands. So I think news brands have a particular importance in pandemics and in extreme events generally. And I think people will sort of move to those trusted and relied brands, even if that's online, rather than rather than simply just going to social media sites more generally. So I think there is definitely a kind of sense of the importance of news brands and the continued importance of news brands, even if it's not necessarily accessed.
Okay, and Liz continues on to ask, so if that's the case, in terms of future generations, where will, so you said that there is still a role for those trusted and reliable brands, but in terms of future generations, where are we going with that, if you were speculating?
Well, I think if there's another extreme event, I don't know, let's say 20 years time, or 30 or 40 years time, I think, it's going to be very difficult to talk about people going to watch television. I think the people are going to definitely, the way in which we're going to be informed is going to be radically different. But I still think whatever internet universe we are in, I think that's going to be populated by a kind of variety of continued news brands. And I think people in that environment are still going to want to have trusted and reliable sources of information in extreme events, and I think that is the key thing. Perhaps outside those extreme events, they may be more focused on a kind of wider source of news and information.
Yeah, thank you, Sabina. I wonder if you wanted to reflect on those questions as well.
Yeah, a couple of points perhaps. I mean, one is a methodological question for James, because in your graph that you were showing, you were referring to BBC TV, but I'm wondering, to what extent the survey also looked at the use of the BBC app or even the BBC website, because I think that is an important part of how the landscape been changing and can help address this question of the future as well, because I think we shouldn't get too hung up on the dichotomy between television and digital media, because television has gone digital, and we should be thinking in terms of streaming and broadcasting more generally in this context. And what's certainly coming through in our data, for instance, is not so much a straightforward generational difference in terms of using television versus digital media, but where you go to look for your live stream of a government press conference. Yeah, do you go to the government's Facebook channel and look at the stream there, or do you go to the public broadcaster's app or website or some other news website that is streaming the same event? And that is a crucial difference, I think, that probably surveys perhaps don't capture so much. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is it's not so straightforward. So I wouldn't write off television or public broadcasting for that matter, as long as it's able to adapt.
Yeah, no, to come back, Sabina, no, the survey distinguished between BBC TV and BBC Online and BBC Radio. So you had those distinctions, and again, I think in a way, these, as like with all surveys, it asks the respondent to distinguish. And I can imagine in a world of the smart televisions, is that an internet connection or is it a television or whatever? So in a way, you're right, those divisions might be more difficult on how we access live. And it says BBC TV as well, not BBC News. So it's very difficult, but that's one of the downsides of not commissioning the survey. You don't necessarily get to determine how questions are specified, but it is free and it's an available public resource. So you kind of have to take the rough with the smooth.
Brilliant, thank you. Sabina, I've got a question for you here. So this is from Paula Salco. So was there a similar political mobilization via COVID and mask wearing and populism in countries like, for instance, the US?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Paula. And the thing is that probably because we're all accustomed to looking at what has been happening in the US, you might perhaps assume that all populists have been behaving in this way. And obviously Bolsonaro has. I mean, both Trump and Bolsonaro have had this attitude of, denying the pandemic is quite as serious as it is, at least initially, or in Bolsonaro's case, certainly this continues. But in Eastern Europe, it was different. So populist leaders did take, actually, after some initial hesitancy, they did take the pandemic seriously, and then they actually locked down the countries relatively early when the cases were very low with the first wave. Second wave was a different story. I'm not going to go there. So it was a different response. And also then there wasn't, so the specific measures weren't actually politicized in the way in a way as mask wearing was in the US. So it was a very different approach there. So polarization was happening more at the level of, do you actually trust the government is doing the right thing or not? It wasn't, so the government themselves weren't trying to politicize the specific measures in a way, in the way Trump was.
Thank you. Thank you for that. OK, I've got a question for both speakers. So perhaps, James, you'd like to address this first. This is from Ellie Belfiore. So she asks, does your research suggest that the pandemic crisis has brought about an increased awareness in the general public of the risk of coming across misinformation compared to pre-pandemic times? And if so, what might be the long-term consequences of that enhanced awareness, if indeed you found that?
Ellie, that's a good question, Ellie. So the trouble with this is a survey that was kind of the difficulty when asking the survey question whether people have come across misinformation or fake news or whatever is you're very reliant on their interpretation of what it is. So it's really difficult to know. And people reported they'd seen fake news or they'd been told fake news. So all I saw was the survey responses, but you don't necessarily know what that story is or how fake it is, or whether they were simply, there was that, I think one of the key interesting aspects, which is I haven't gone through in this in the presentation, but it's in the paper, is about, the story about Trump and injecting disinfectant, and I don't remember if everyone remembers that, or this is a way of and everyone was familiar with that. They all claimed they'd come across that, but actually what they found is they came across that not on social media but on the mainstream news. So in a way there is, you could argue quite rightly, there's an inoculation effect. So actually I'm finding out about fake news not through personal exposure but through being told by the news, the mainstream news, about the fake news. And in a way, there's that issue going on. And there's some interesting research around exposure to fake news. And some people argue actually most people, particularly get exposed to fake news stories, at least ones they are told are fake, through the mainstream media. So you could argue this is part of an inoculation effect. There's all that health communication research about inoculation and inoculating messages. This could be part of that and actually serves as a positive thing. Or it could generate increase of suspicion. I mean, I don't know. You go on and you just have to trust brands, which goes back to my earlier point, because everything's so unknown and unknowable, and you haven't got the time to, we're all cognitive misers. We haven't got the time to go and search and all the fact checking sites. We trust brands more.
Shall I chip in here?
Yes, yes, please do, Sabina.
Yeah. So I would say yes, but I think similar to what James is saying. The question is what people actually perceived as misinformation and where it was coming from. I think that was still, especially in the early phase where we were conducting our research, the main problem was not so much believing necessarily in a straightforward way misinformation or conspiracy theories, but just being so disoriented and shocked by everything that was happening that people were grasping for straws and being just more open, because of, a general sense of doubt and distrust to alternative explanations. Yes, that was, accompanied by an awareness of not so much misinformation spreading, but of the uncertainty of the information environment. Yeah. In general terms, and some people were navigating that more successfully than others, and it depended very much on the general situation in the country, with polarization, with the general levels of trust in the media system, in mainstream media, in political elites. So the less trust you had as a baseline, and the more polarized the environment was, the more open people were to misinformation. And a greater level of awareness actually didn't necessarily help. They might have made things worse, if that makes sense. So sorry, this is perhaps a more pessimistic spin on your rather optimistic answer question.
It's good to have 2 points of view. Thank you, Sabina. Sabina, I've got another question here for you. This one's from Darren Lilliker. He asks, we also found a link between distrust in messages and where mixed messages circulated between elites. Obviously, the US is a great example of that. He asks, did you also find any link between attitudes? For example, the link between holding populist attitudes and mistrusting COVID messages. He also says, by the way, that he's happy to share any aspects of his research with you.
Oh, great, Aaron. I'd absolutely love to. So I'll get in touch separately then to discuss this further. But I guess in a way there was a link in this case in our countries. There was a link between trusting the measures and what the governments were implementing, and populist attitudes, not mistrust, but because these were the measures that were introduced by populist governments. So in Serbia and Hungary, you had, Orban and Vucic introducing these measures, and it was the anti-government, so the opposition, that was more distrustful. So it was a different, or was it the same link you found? So yeah, an interesting alignment. It really depended, where the populists were, whether they were in power and what they were doing, whether they were taking the pandemic seriously or not, I would say. But yeah, happy to continue offline. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sabina. I should also mention that in his research, he also covered Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary. So, OK, I've got a question now from Laura for James. Laura says, Laura says, really interesting data. Can you tell me if the detail around BBC Radio is broken down to particular stations? And if so, which stations are the most used? Also, were there any other demographic details to explore?
Yeah, no, thank you, Laura. I've penned a response in the chat, but just to reiterate, there was, I can't remember off the top of my head, there was some breakdown of radio stations, not particularly detailed to all the radio stations you would get, let's say, on the commercial bandwidth, but yes, and in terms of the data, well, the data in terms of demographic data, that was probably probably the best. What I showed was the main divisions. They broke age down into more fine tuned, but I was looking to kind of contrast more rather than provide, a difference between every particular age group. So I try to capture this kind of where the strongest potential differences lay anyway.
Thanks for that, James. OK, and with perfect timing, final question. I'm going to take this final question and then we can go to a quick break. So Vaclav, and apologies if I've pronounced that incorrectly. He asks, just before the pandemic, the BBC was under heavy pressure from the government, threatening to change the funding model. Indeed, it was. That might even see the end of public service broadcasting. Do you think that the performance of the BBC during the pandemic, in terms of the viewership figures as well as trust, has helped the BBC to strengthen its position within the UK media system? Great question. I think that's for you, James.
Yeah, well, I'm sure everyone's got an opinion on it too, but I would say yes to a certain extent. I would say that the BBC has played a central role during the pandemic, and I think it's perhaps if it was in a weaker position, it's in perhaps in a more stable position now. But then again, what it'd be like when the license fee comes up for renewal, I don't know, and the big issues around the license fee and funding. So I think the position's there, but whether that means more funding and an enhanced role, I don't know. I think the jury's still out. OK, great. OK, good session.
We've got scheduled now a 15-minute break. So if I can suggest people take advantage of the comfort break, make yourself a cup of tea, etc., and we will reconvene here for the next part of the programme at 3:15 sharp. Okay, brilliant. Thank you speakers, and thank you questioners. It was a really great discussion. Bye.